I'm Pastor Horton. Welcome to this week's interview where we have Congressman Barry Loudermilk. Welcome to the show.
Oh, it's good to be with you. Been looking forward to doing this for a while.
Absolutely. So we talked a little bit before the recording started, and you gave your testimony, and it's it still got me kind of in shock because it's so jam-packed full of action and all kinds of stuff. Do you mind just sharing that for the audience?
Well, not at all, because, our testimony is something that God has given us. I believe we need to share it, even as extraordinary as this sounds. I've even had people tell me, look, you're making this stuff up, and I'm really not. Um, just a little background on me. I'm a Georgia native. I was born in the South in Georgia to a World War II veteran. My dad was a medic in World War II in the European theater, landed at D-Day, went through the Battle of the Bulge and on into Germany. But I was a latecomer. So he was in his 40s, his mid 40s by the time I was born. My brother and sister are 15, 16 years older than I am. And so as I was growing up, most of my friends, it was their grandfathers that were the World War II veterans. So I always won the bragging rights. It was my dad that was actually there. But one thing about my dad is a very, very strong man of faith, dedicated Christian. He didn't have a college degree, but he was one of the smartest people I ever met because he had that common sense wisdom and the biblical knowledge to back it up. And so I grew up in a very strong Christian household. And so a lot of what he taught me still resonates with me and prepared me for where I am now. But um, after I graduated high school, I moved to Alaska to work construction for the summer. While I was there, I was involved in a church, started working in the bus ministry, met a young lady who had moved up from Florida to do the same thing. Her parents had moved up to work construction. All of us were supposed to be there temporary. But once we met, I mean, I met her at church. We were inseparable after that. We've been now married over 43 years, but
Wow.
um, I ended up staying in Alaska instead of coming back to Georgia. It was 15 years before I actually made it back. But while I was there, I mean, it was one of these things. I never excelled in high school. I did in sports, played football, and I had a couple scholarship offers, but I was never academically inclined. I just think I wasn't challenged enough there. So I'm one of these guys that I tell people I barely graduated high school. In fact, when I proposed to my wife, the her cousins were the ones who introduced us, and I mean they went to our church, they worked really hard to get us together to start dating. But when I proposed to her, one of her cousins says, "Why do you want to join? Why do you want to marry him? He's nothing but a dumb country boy and probably never amount to anything." And he wasn't far from right. I just didn't have any real aspiration other than get a job, provide for my family, just live a peaceful, quiet life. But that isn't what God had planned, as I would find out later. I ended up joining the Air Force. I spent 8 years in the Air Force. And that's when a lot of the influence on my life began as a Christian in the military. Um, I've had a lot of different influences, and as I go back through life now, I see the different people from all over that were just, it was like iron sharpening iron, just little changes in my life. But the real change started after my last duty assignment. Before I left the Air Force, I was assigned back to Alaska, same city I had lived in Anchorage. Ended up leaving the Air Force after Operation Desert Storm, and I went to work for a defense contractor there. Now, my parents had never moved away from Alaska. After we moved up from Georgia, right after I graduated high school, they stayed there. And one thing about my dad is he's always had these big dreams. And one of the dreams he had, now he's 70 years old, World War II veteran, living in Alaska. He had this dream of making this backcountry hike. It's called the Crow Pass Trail. It's 27 miles. It is truly Alaska wilderness. I mean, when you're out there, there were no cell phones back then, but even this was 1993. Um, there's no cell service even there today. I mean, it's truly a backcountry hike. It's just something he always wanted to do, and so we decided to do it on Memorial Day weekend. And it's a very rugged trail. The trailhead is like 10 miles back down a dirt road, a dead end of a dirt road. So you're a long way. But when you start the trail, you're a long way from any civilization, anyhow. But the first 3.5 miles, you climb almost 3,000 feet. It's a very steep climb, and then you cross over a pass. We when we started off, it was the low 70s down at the trailhead. By the time we got to the summit, we were in waist deep snow, and we crossed over the summit. It was about 4 hours into the hike, and this is the worst part of the hike. If you can, there's really only two really treacherous areas. How steep the first part is, and then crossing over the ice fields to descend in the valley. You've got a gorge to cross over. It's harrowing. At the time it had a very narrow catwalk across this gorge that drops 150 feet down right under you with this waterfall that's just incredibly loud. But there were no handrails back then. But that's no problem, right? But then the next really challenging part is fording through a glacial-fed river, which the current can be pretty strong. But if you're healthy and you don't have injuries, it's not that bad. So
Yeah.
our goal was to make it to that river by that evening, and the first evening, spend the night so we could cross in the morning when the water level was low, because the glacier that feeds the river is only a quarter mile upstream. And so later in the day, there's more melt off the glacier, higher currents. But anyhow, as we're hiking across these sloping ice fields, my dad slips. He falls, his leg goes down into a small crevasse, and his foot and ankle get jammed between two rocks. Well, that causes him to lose his balance. So he falls backwards, and we're carrying 50-pound packs. I mean, we were budget hikers. We didn't have all the fancy lightweight stuff. But as he falls backwards, because we're on this slope, an icy slope, gravity starts pulling his upper body down to the right, and his knee is taking all of that torque, and he hears a pop, and it ended up he tore the ligaments and tendons out of his knee. So this becomes 48 hours of survival now. The best course of action we had was to continue the way we were going, because it was too painful for him to descend. And it was such a steep climb coming up the other side. That would have been really bad descent. And then when we got to the trailhead, there would be nothing to do, because my brother had dropped us off at the trailhead and gone. So we decided we still had 22, 23 miles of trail, and we just needed, that's the best thing we could do, is just keep going. But we ended up getting charged by bears. I was surrounded by wolves. Had two bear encounters, one with a black bear, one with a grizzly. We fording that river, we were in literally frigid, ice cold water for 45 minutes, which was almost a blessing too, because that helped the swelling go down in his knee. And there for a couple miles, we were able to move a little better. But for the most part, he's barely just moving. But all in all, we made it out. He ended up having a couple of surgeries to be able to walk again, but he made a full recovery. But I journaled this 48 hours of survival with a 70-year-old World War II veteran, and all the things that I learned from it, because I could see God working in my life, preparing me for something, and I didn't know what it was. I mean, I had just left the Air Force. I'm working for a defense contractor as a low-level IT guy. But I journaled all this. Now, fast forward, end up leaving Alaska, moving back to my home state of Georgia, starting a small business. And I'm sensing that God is calling me to do something else. And so I started every Saturday morning, I would go out in my backyard. Behind my backyard's an old historic cemetery that goes back to the Civil War. And I always found it very peaceful out there, because nobody bothers you out there. But I had this place I would sit and pray. And I just kept feeling this drawing that God had something else prepared for me in my life. I mean, I was already impressed that I was a small business owner. I never thought I would make it to that level after growing up in low-income housing as a child. But God used the story of Jesus walking on the water to show me how when Peter asked Jesus if he could come to him, Jesus basically told Peter, step out of the storm, or step out of the boat and into the storm. And the storm didn't cease until Peter exercised his faith. He stepped out of the boat into the storm, walked to Jesus, and they walked back to the boat together. And God showed me I need people who are willing to step out of the boat being that safety net of their family, their friends, with your comfortable job, these things. I need people who are willing to step out of their boat into the storm to save our nation, to save our states. And so I told my wife, I said, there's other plans that God has for us. I don't know what they are yet. Fast forward from that point, he opens the door for me to get involved in politics, which I was never really interested in. But I ended up serving in the state house of Georgia, then the state senate, and then miraculously I got elected to Congress, something that was never in my wheelhouse. But once I got into Congress, then the real trials started. My second year in Congress, I was involved in a domestic terrorist attack as a victim. I got shot at over 22 times. Miraculously saved. I had bullets going by so close to my head I could hear the bullets whistling as they passed by. I stayed in the line of fire because one of my colleagues, one of the assistant coaches, had been shot, took a bullet in the back, came out his chest, and I needed to stay and help him. So I ended up staying in the line of fire, and this shootout lasted for over 8 minutes. I think it was about 2 months after that. My wife and I were involved in a very suspicious car wreck. We were hit from the behind on the interstate and flipped over, I don't know, 4 or 5 times. Car ended up on its side. They had to pull us out of the vehicle. We shouldn't have survived, but we did. 2 weeks after that, we were shot at by what the FBI said was an assassin targeting us. We were shot in our car. Fortunately, the elevation of the bullet was off and it struck the back of our car instead of the headrest, the driver's headrest, what they said the assassin was aiming at. They never caught the guy. Very suspicious circumstances regarding that as well that if I got into, most people wouldn't even believe, but it's pretty incredible. Ended up involved in a train wreck a couple months after that. So we had these series of all these very traumatic events that are happening to us. But through all this, we feel like there's something, I mean, that God has for us. When you look at it, I mean, most people in their entire lifetimes wouldn't go through something as traumatic as any of one of those. But we've had this series of trauma, one after another. But I'm learning through each one, and I learn through what in Romans tells us, take joy in your tribulation, because that's basically God teaching you. I mean, by the time we had this terrible car wreck, which was very horrific, I remember as they were rushing us to the hospital thinking, okay, God, you brought me through this baseball shooting. You're going to bring me through this, right? So each time I'm gaining more confidence, more faith, because God is using those moments of trauma to build our faith. And then we go through this period, this hiatus of nothing really big happening, but I've got a testimony. I have a lot of people ask me at churches to come and give my testimony, and doing a lot of organizations, conferences and stuff. So we're able to share what God had done in our lives and helping other people who are going through trauma. And so I think maybe that's what the purpose is. And then in 2023, I feel I get betrayed by people within the federal government, and I was falsely accused of an act of treason, which was actually an act of retribution because of openly criticizing some actions that were unconstitutional as well as illegal and unethical that were being taken against some other people, but I didn't realize the force that I was criticizing. And so they went after me with the full force of the federal government. Even as a sitting member of Congress, it was the worst time of our lives. I got over 200 death threats in 2 weeks after the news broke of this.
Wow.
But as I'm looking at this, I see that there has been a purpose in everything that goes all the way back to the beginning of my life. But the real transition began on that trail with my father, because I found that journal just a few years ago, and I went back and I read the journal. I mean, I had not even picked up that journal probably since I wrote it. Um, but I found it, I went over it, and I was so shocked to see that everything that we faced, every obstacle, every challenge that we faced on that trail, that 48 hours of survival, related to one of these other trials and tribulations I went through later. It was like God was using that to prepare me to be ready for this, to prepare me to be ready for this accusation that I had to go through, which then put things in place to where I led one of the most consequential investigations in history, unveiling the truth and revealing government conspiracy and cover-ups within our federal government. And as I go back and I look now, is well, I would have never been selected for that committee had not I been falsely accused of doing certain things, because the reason the Speaker of the House chose me to lead that committee is because the people who accused me had accused other people of things, and I knew how they even created evidence, falsified evidence. He said, look, no one is better suited to do this than you. And so I ended up thinking about it later. I'm like, oh, none of this would have been uncovered had not I been falsely accused and been very motivated to get to the bottom of this. Um, I would have never been able to handle that false accusation had I not gone through those other tribulations, the shootings, the car wrecks, the train wrecks. Everything was preparing me for something else. And I would have never been able to handle those had not I gone through the trials and tribulations of the Crow Pass Trail. And so, as I tell people, when you think of my life, I mean, I've been through uh, car wrecks, train wrecks, shootings, assassination attempts. I've flown on Air Force One with the president. I've had personal meetings in the Oval Office with the president. I mean, this thing sounds like, and government cover ups and conspiracies and all this sounds like a spy novel, but it's really my life. But I tell people I'm just an ordinary guy that God chose to live an extraordinary life. I don't recommend this life to anybody,
Oh,
but with God, all things are possible. And but we do have to submit to Him, and that's the one key part. Is when I go back to that prayer I made in that in my backyard when God was revealing to me He had something else. I had to submit to Him, and you know whether I would have gone through these things or not, I don't know. I don't think I would have had I not taken, just put my faith in God. But I do know that when you are on path with Him, He's going to bring you through. And it's not always going to be easy, but you will come through. So that's about as little detail of my testimony as I can give. But
yeah.
we do have I do have a book that we're thinking it will probably be out later this year, that's kind of going through all of this and how I went from living in low income housing as a latchkey kid in the 70s to as the book opens up, I'm sitting in South Korea in the presidential conference room negotiating um, something with the president of South Korea. 3 days earlier, I was in Japan meeting with the prime minister of Japan, negotiating on behalf of the United States as part of a congressional delegation.
Wow.
And as I was sitting in South Korea, I'm sitting here thinking, how did I get here? How did I go from being this latchkey kid of hardworking parents, but we were literally paycheck to paycheck as I was growing up, in low income housing. If people aren't familiar with the latchkey kid term, it was very popular in the 70s. It's when all of a sudden, you had two working parents, and they would actually, your house key was tied to a string that you wore over your neck like a necklace, right? And that because the kids whose parents were working, and you kind of had to take care of yourself after school,
Hmm.
get to and from school, and you were on your own till they got home from work. They were known as latchkey kids, and that was me. And I mean, it was a derogatory term then, but I loved the freedom that came with it, and it also, helped teach me responsibility. But to go from that background to negotiating on behalf of the most powerful government in the world, the United States of America, with a foreign ally on foreign policy. that doesn't happen unless God's involved.
Nope. So, it's very interesting the way you kind of frame it from your childhood to now. Um, my grandpa has actually said similar things about me because
Wow.
I was raised in a home where both parents were working full time. Not quite the same as latchkey because we had an electronic lock on the door. So, but it's kind of the same premise, and it wasn't a great home. It wasn't the best home in the world, and I didn't pay attention in school very much. I really just skated by, and I called my grandpa the other day and said, "Hey, I just got accepted into the college honor program for where I'm at." He's like, "That's incredible." And I hung up the phone and I started thinking about it. From 5 years ago to now, I've seen insane things that, I mean, it's not quite the same as assassination attempts and that kind of stuff, but I went from I'm going to skate by in life to I'm an ordained minister. I'm the president of a corporation. I'm a published author. I'm an honor student. I'm a volunteer at a church. Like all of these different things where none of this would have been possible without God.
That's right.
And it's incredible to see the way that God works in people's lives. And I've talked before about how God doesn't put us through the bad things in life, but he doesn't stop them from happening
All right.
because he's going to use that some way or another.
Well,
Um,
I believe it's part of our training. You know,
yeah.
God has a calling for you, but you have to be prepared. It was like when I went through boot camp in the Air Force, same thing. My youngest son, he was an airborne infantryman in the Army. Just before he went to boot camp, I told him, I said, look, it's going to be tough. Look at it one day at a time, make it through
Hmm.
each day. And, but just keep in mind the reason they're so tough on you is they're preparing you for something even worse, right? There's nothing worse than going through combat, you know, for a soldier. Um, but they're hard on you. You don't sleep much, you don't eat much. They're trying to break you down because they don't they're really trying to weed out those that just can't handle it, but they're also trying to build someone to the point of that you can handle the horrors of combat. And so just keep in mind that it's supposed to be tough. It's supposed to be bad. And I think it's the same thing with God. I mean, look at what in Peter, you know, Paul was saying, "Join me in the hardships of a good soldier of Christ." Okay, that's scriptural. There, it's just being a Christian, being a soldier for Christ. Let me say, there are hardships that are along with it, and so,
Yeah.
and I think that's why Paul said in Romans that take joy in our tribulation because that teaches us patience, perseverance, I should say, and experience, and then that builds faith. And I'm paraphrasing, but from as each of the instances I've been through, that taught me, look, I made it through the last thing, I can make it through this thing. And so I think that's like you're young. I'm 62, and so I've got more history in my life than I do future. But God's not done preparing me for something else, and there's no telling where He's going to take you as long as we're submitting to Him and building that faith. One thing that I'd realized about my dad before we did that venture hike about 10 years before that, right after we moved to Alaska, we went on a river fishing trip. We were going down one of these, another glacial fed river with my brother-in-law and my sister and her family. And we were taking a boat downstream and the motor basically seized up on us. And we were less than a mile from what was known as the canyon, which was class 3 rapids. And we're going through this we're on this flat bottom John boat, which we knew if we got to those rapids, it was very dangerous, if not deadly. We ended up getting to this little island in the middle of the river and we were stranded. And I'm panicking. I'm 17 years old. I've never, to me, hiking was going to a state park in Alaska. Now we're out in the middle of Alaska wilderness, stranded on this island. Didn't know what we are going to do, how long we were going to be there. I'm panicking. But here's my dad, this World War II veteran. I mean, he's just like, well, let's start fishing. And I'm like, shouldn't we be panicked and worried and try to figure things out? And his idea was, hey, there's nothing we can do about it right now until somebody happens to come by. So let's just start fishing. And I started thinking about it. I'm like, did he have more faith than me? Yes, he did. But it wasn't because I didn't trust God. But being a World War II combat veteran, he'd been through a whole lot worse, right? So, yeah, he had more faith because he saw that God brought him through combat in World War II. God's definitely going to bring him off of this remote island that we're just stranded on in Alaska. And
Yeah.
so I started realizing, yes, the more tribulation we go through, God builds our faith through that.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the great things about going through trials also is that it does give you that experience. So one of the parts of my testimony is I have struggled with depression and suicidal thoughts, and I actually ended up in the hospital. For a long time I thought, well, it's something I have to deal with, it's something I have to struggle with, and I came to faith, which helped a lot. But then I had an opportunity open up to go to a workshop to learn about suicidal desperation. And I learned about all of this. And then an opportunity with the church popped up. And the church that I attend said, hey, you went through this. We would love to have you teach this to other people. And I said, well, sure. Yeah. And so from my experience with this terrible thing, I ended up teaching middle schoolers, their parents, high schoolers, and I'll be teaching our care ministry about the signs and what to do when somebody is going through suicidal desperation. And all of that from just a terrible thing that I had to struggle with.
And no one can relate to them as well as you can.
Yeah.
And as I think you're exactly right, God allows us to go through these things. I mean, He doesn't have to put them on us. Just
No.
the sin nature of the world is going to bring this stuff on us, right? Um, but if we also persevere, and as I shared with you earlier, one of the lessons I've learned through my life is always keep your eye on your cause, not your circumstances. And there's some great stories from American history that just of people who are so focused on their mission, they overcome insurmountable odds. And it's because they're not focused on those, right? No, it's like no one told them how bad it really was. So therefore, they didn't know not to just, achieve. Um, but is having gone through these things, then God bringing us through, you have a trust level that 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 will resonate with people is like he knows this isn't just some psychiatrist telling me, well, here's what I learned in college. You've been through it. You're probably going to save thousands of lives or hundreds of lives, or just making a difference in people's lives because of what God has brought you through.
That's always the goal.
Yeah.
Um yeah, and it's another part of that testimony is we can't do it alone. And sometimes that doesn't look like a human because one of the worst nights of my life, I was sitting there, I had a knife under my bed that I was prepared to use. And I felt my cat jump up on my bed. And this is a 20-pound, real fat cat, loved him to death. And he jumped up on my bed and curled up in my arm to sleep. And I kind of felt peaceful. So I reach over to pet him, and then I remember that he died 4 months prior.
Oh wow.
And so all of a sudden, I'm laying in bed, tears had been running down my face, and I start laughing because, like, what's going on? There's no way to explain this. And a sense of calm peace washed over me, and I fell asleep. I woke up the next day and I was like, okay, well, thanks, Ruckus, which was the cat's name. And it's only until, I mean, a few months ago, this happened years ago. It's only until a few months ago that I realized, like, that was God communicating with me
Yeah,
in a way that I would understand. And
that's awesome.
it's that kind of communication that God's not always going to speak to you. He's not going to appear in a burning bush. Sometimes it's sending a friend to call you or
Right.
sending your pet to check on you. And
One of the things you were talking about, having a friend call you, this is something else I like to emphasize on people. If you feel the drawing of the Holy Spirit to do something, you need to do it,
yes,
because that friend was following God's lead to give you a call, or, and or maybe it's been put on your heart to just call somebody. You don't know why, but following that, you could be having a huge impact on that individual.
yeah. So I want to say what popped into my head when you talked about don't tell us the odds, the insurmountable battles that these American heroes would fight. I mean, the first one that popped in my head was the fight for independence,
Oh yeah,
because Britain at the time was the world superpower,
exactly.
and you've got this ragtag team of Americans saying no, and nobody told them the odds. And here we are. I mean,
Right.
greatest country in the world because we didn't listen to the odds.
Right. And that's evident. And one thing that my father taught me was a lot of stories from American history. They're no longer taught in schools. And the reason they're not taught is you can't separate divine providence from the story. There's no way. But those acts of divine providence are built into even our very founding documents. But if you go back and you look at the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin stood up as he called for prayer to open every session, because the Constitutional Convention was falling apart. And he made this incredible speech, which I know you're going to talk about my book later, but I have that speech in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he spoke about acts of divine providence during our own War of Independence, and he just casually mentions it like everybody knows. And then George Washington, as the first president of the United States, his first action was to declare a day of thanksgiving and prayer, acknowledging the numerous acts of divine providence through our history. So these are things that they knew were divine. But there's one instance that, if you read the Declaration of Independence, I encourage everybody knows the first couple of paragraphs. That's what's quoted. But to me, exactly what you were talking about is the impossible is written in the last sentence. And Jefferson drafted this. It says, and in support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor. That's the last words of the Declaration of Independence. It's saying we know that what we're trying to do is impossible. I mean, we are taking on the most powerful military force in the history of the world. And as you accurately described, was with a ragtag rabble. That's what the British called Washington's Continental Army, a ragtag rabble. They knew that was impossible, but they knew who specialized in achieving the impossible. So Jefferson was asked years later, what was the inspiration of that line? And he said, well, that actually came from the book of Daniel, the Old Testament. And it was the story of the three Hebrew children, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. If you remember, they refused to bow to the king. The
Mm-hmm.
king said, you either do it or we're going to throw you in this furnace. So they basically said, we believe, if you throw us in the furnace, we believe that God will protect us. But if not, we still won't bow. So they're saying, they're committing, they're standing with God, even to death. But as we know, they were protected, right? So Jefferson was saying the same thing, is by signing this document, we're saying we believe God will protect us, but if he doesn't, we're still going to commit our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor for this idea of freedom and independence. And so it is about facing insurmountable odds, but keeping your eye on your cause, not your circumstance. You go back into American war for independence, we lost many more battles than we won. but we
Yeah.
won through a war of perseverance. Is as one British general said, the Americans were very frustrating because we would fight, lose, and then come back and fight again, lose and come back and fight again. And we just wore the British down because of we were so dedicated to the cause of freedom.
Yeah. So you mentioned your book, and we are running a little short on time. So do you want to talk about that for a minute? Just kind of explain it.
Yeah, it's called "And Then They Prayed," and we talked a little bit about the War for Independence and the acts of divine providence. And there's a lot of books about acts of divine providence in our independence, but War for Independence. But that providence continued on through the history of the United States, and there I could not find any books on that years ago. And a lot of these were stories that my dad shared with me. So my family and I, we started a 10-year venture of studying and building. Uh, Writing this book based on true fact, but we're writing it in a dramatic form. So instead of hearing about George Washington at Valley Forge, you're at Valley Forge with George Washington, because I couldn't just research Washington to do that. I just research everybody who's around him. And so
Yeah.
these are 14 times that we as a country have been faced with insurmountable odds, but we have been able to overcome those through prayer. And the title "And Then They Prayed" really comes from one of the stories in there, and it's from General George Patton, who was a firm believer in prayer. A lot of people don't realize that, but it's from a miraculous event. I won't go too deep into it because you can get the book and find out the full story. But it was he wanted everybody in the Third Army praying for good weather for battle, because he was ready to go into Germany and end World War II. So he asked his chaplain to write a prayer for good weather for battle. And as he was talking to his chaplain, he started explaining the power of prayer to the chaplain. And he said, the reason we've been so successful since we landed at Normandy on D-Day has been because of the prayers of people back home. But that's not good enough anymore. We have to be praying ourselves to go forward in battle. And he said there's three things that basically determine victory or defeat in battle. It's first is planning.
Mm-hmm.
He said that's what we do. We plan. We go through battle plans. We plan out every operation. There's working. So you have planning and working. Working is the execution of the plan. That's the training and the actual fighting that our men do. But he said the third factor is a void that really determines victory or defeat. And that void is what I call prayer. It's divine guidance. And so when I look at that as planning, working, and prayer, those are the three things that General George Patton said you had to be victorious in battle: planning, working, and prayer. And as I look back on all these stories that go from the 1740s all the way up to the 20th century, the Apollo 8 space mission, uh, there was one thing in common. Whenever our backs were against the wall and the circumstances were overwhelming, our national heroes prayed, they worked, and then, or they planned, they worked, and then they prayed. And so that's where the title comes from. Um, we've hit bestseller status a few times over the last year. We released it on July 4th last year. Um, when I released it, some friends of mine, Newt Gingrich and some other political types, had endorsed it. Some also religious leaders. We have pastors that have used it in sermons as sermon guides, and churches use it as Sunday school guides. But I decided to give one of the pre-release copies to President Trump. He had actually asked me to come to the Oval Office and meet with him, seeking my advice on a couple of things. And so this was the 1st of June last year. So I just grabbed one of the pre-release copies and I took it to the Oval Office with me and I gave it to him. And I had inscribed on the inside of it, to someone who has also experienced act of divine providence. If you remember the assassination attempt on his life, the bullet just nicked his ear. When he read that, he turned and he pointed to his ear and he said, "Barry, if God had not told me to turn my head at that moment, I wouldn't be here today." So he was acknowledging that act of providence. So I left the book with him after our meeting. I was in there for about an hour. I was back over to the White House a couple of weeks later, and one of the staff members who was in that meeting with us, He told me, he said, that book you gave the president. I said, yeah. He said, he's kept it on his desk for 2 weeks. He's been reading it. I'm like, you got to be kidding. I just figured he'd go file it away somewhere. Hey, I got my picture with handing it to the president, right? That's what I wanted out of him. He had been reading it. And then I've heard that it has had some influence on him. So back in October, out of nowhere, President Trump just sends out a True Social endorsing the book. And so, of course, we had to go back to press, and then Newt Gingrich's endorsement was on the front, and so we were moved news to the back and put the President of the United States on the front of the book. But this book it's 14 stories that are absolutely incredible. They're written in story form. It's engaging, as Glenn Beck said, as he dedicated a portion of one of his radio shows podcast about it, is one of the best books he ever read. And so we just want to get, especially with America now in our 250th birthday, people need to understand where we came from. People ask me all the time, are we able to go another 250 years? I mean, we've far exceeded the the life of any constitutional republic in history. I mean, no one ever expected us to go this far. And so people ask me all the time, is can we go any further? And I said, absolutely. If we go back and we see what sustained us for the first 250 years and repeat that, then we will survive even longer. There's a scripture that I share with people that is incredibly important here. And it's the first chapter of Ecclesiastes. I believe it's Ecclesiastes 1:9. It says, whatever will happen has already happened. There is nothing new under the sun. Of course, I'm paraphrasing again, but it's basically saying, because, and this was written 2,000 years before Jesus, right? By then, the scripture's saying everything that can happen in life has already happened, right? There's nothing new. So if you want to know how to deal with something, you need to go back in time and look at how it was dealt with before. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel. And that was one of the key elements of our founders, was they understood that. That's why they went back and they looked at ancient forms of government as they formed our government. And I'll just share this with you. It was during, because we were talking about the War for Independence and our Declaration of Independence. Well, when the debate over whether or not to separate from England was going on in the Second Continental Congress, you had John Adams, who was a strong patriot. He gave a speech known as Liberty Now and Liberty Forever. And then there was John Dickinson from Pennsylvania, who was also a patriot, but he was a realist. He's the one who looked at the circumstances, and he understood that it's impossible to defeat England on the field of battle. So he gave a speech that was known as the Doomsday of America speech. Well, Benjamin Rush, another delegate, was sitting next to John Adams. And as John Dickinson gave his Doomsday speech, he leaned over to John Adams. And I'm just quoting directly from Benjamin Rush's journal. He said, I asked John Adams, do you believe that we can succeed in this war for independence? He said, John Adams didn't hesitate. He said, yes, if we pray and we ask God to forgive us of our sins. John Adams was quoting 2 Chronicles 7:14, right? Which we quote all the time. You know, if my people will ask for the forgiveness of their sins and humble themselves and pray, I will heal their land, right? John Adams was looking in the past at when another nation was facing similar circumstances and saw that God brought them through, being ancient Israel, when they submitted themselves to him. So the book is called And Then They Prayed. It's at Amazon. If you want more information about it, you can go to my website, barryloudermilk.com, or andthentheyprayed.com. But it is on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Walmart. We hit bestseller on Walmart back in October last year. We really, really want to get this into as many people's hands as we can, because it'll help prepare you for this 250th anniversary. I mean, we're going to be celebrating 250 years as a constitutional republic, that we're only here because of divine providence. And so we've gotten great reviews on it, and very excited about it. And I appreciate you giving me a chance to talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. To anybody who may be interested, I will have all of those links down in the show notes. So you can find those and find the book anywhere that he's just said. Um, Barry, thank you so much for
My
joining.
pleasure.
It's been an absolute honor to have you.
Well, I'm glad we could make it happen, and I appreciate you giving me the time and the platform. And this is all about giving glory to God. And as we continue down the path, we're going to all face troubles and trials, but also as I tell people, they say, "How could?" I had a reporter one time look at me and say, "With all you've been through, how can you still smile?" And I'm like, "Because I know God is with me, and the greater the trial, the greater the victory." And so you just
Amen.
got to hold on.
To everybody out there, I truly hope that this message has inspired you. Again, all of those details will be in the show notes. Thank you again so much for joining us. I hope that you have a wonderful week, and God bless.